soft power and sharp power. The crisis is also affecting the balance of soft power between the United States and China, that is, their respective abilities to wield influence through attraction, their alignment of other nations' values and underlying preferences with their own, and their sheer capacity to manufacture and deliver what the world needs. In this domain and by all rights, COVID-19 should have put Beijing on its back foot. Regional Communist Party officials covered up the initial outbreak and the central government hid the virus from both its own citizens and the world. And, just as it did 18 years earlier during the SARS outbreak, Beijing was slow to share vital information with the World Health Organization, dragged its feet on allowing technical teams from the World Health Organization to visit the affected areas, and refused to admit a dedicated team from the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Though natural viruses like COVID-19 are not national creations and no one should blame the Chinese people for the pandemic, a good case can be made that the culpability of the Chinese government for the global spread of the virus is high. Yet, Beijing has thus far managed to avoid being put on the strategic defensive. Instead, it has exploited the absence of U.S. leadership and pursued a multi-pronged approach to turn the crisis into a geopolitical opportunity. First, it has capitalized on its apparent technocratic ability to contain the virus at home. Although reasons to doubt the extent of China's purported progress against the virus persist, Beijing has used a relentless stream of propaganda at home and abroad to create the perception that it has mastered COVID-19 and bought the world time to more effectively respond to the pandemic. Second, China has provided or announced medical assistance to 82 countries in Europe, Asia, Latin America, and Africa, including masks and other personal protective equipment, testing kits, respirators, ventilators, and doctors. China surged medical assistance to Italy even as some of its European Union neighbors failed to respond to Rome's early pleas for help. As EU chief diplomat Josep Borrell recently noted, China is aggressively pushing the message that, unlike the US, it is a responsible and reliable partner. Thomas Wright of the Brookings Institution contends that Beijing's transparent efforts to flip the script may ultimately backfire in many European capitals. Already, some European countries have recalled or rejected Chinese-made masks and testing kits based on their poor quality. But, China's aid has been much better received in many emerging markets and developing countries. In the months ahead, Wright argues that China's efforts may prove particularly effective in parts of Africa, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and Latin America where its Belt and Road Initiative already provides it an economic and political entry point. Overall, China has managed to successfully position itself as the world's leader and public health benefactor on this issue, a role traditionally occupied by the United States. A third and related prong of China's strategy has been the use of so-called sharp power. Beijing has deftly escalated its information campaign against the United States by having senior diplomats promote conspiracy theories that obscure its own role in the pandemic and shift blame to Washington. China has combined public diplomacy with coordinated messaging by state-controlled media, legions of social media bots and trolls, and offers of assistance by Chinese corporate giants to further amplify the narrative that China is both the victim of malign American action and the world's only savior at a time when the United States is pulling back. China's ability to turn COVID-19 lemons into lemonade has been greatly aided by the Trump administration's own acts of commission and omission. In the competition of systems that is so important to soft power, America's democratic, federalist system has looked shambolic. As the Eurasia Group's Mark Hanna observes, The administration's litany of bad decisions makes America look like a nation unable to protect its own people, much less meet complex global challenges. This has only served to accentuate the perceived coherence and competence of China's response and governance model in comparison. Similarly, in the competition for global leadership with Beijing, the Trump administration has essentially ceded the playing field. In both the 2008 to 2009 financial crisis and the 2014 Ebola epidemic, Washington galvanized a worldwide response. But, beyond banning travel from China and Europe, the latter without even consulting America's closest allies, the Trump administration does not appear to care much about events unfolding beyond U.S. shores. It is America first and America only. Traditional friends and allies have been forced to look elsewhere for help, including to Beijing, or to rely solely on themselves. Confusion in messaging has further compounded America's woes. Donald Trump not only initially failed to call out China for its early mishandling of the outbreak, he tweeted out compliments about Xi's decisive leadership. As the virus spread, however, Trump pivoted from denial to blame shifting while U.S. officials began insisting in international fora that COVID-19 be referred to as the Wuhan virus. This rhetoric came across as both xenophobic and small. It did nothing to undermine China's strategic gains from the crisis and, instead, only served to make international cooperation more difficult. Growing apart. Whether one side of the US-Chinese competition ultimately comes out ahead, or simply less far behind, as a result of the pandemic, we can expect the bilateral disruptions, mutual recriminations, and competition for influence to persist for years. The crisis is almost certain to harden public perceptions and further cement the view among elites in both Washington and Beijing that the two nations are locked in a zero-sum showdown and should move to more rapidly decouple their economies. The latter view will be particularly salient in the United States given the revealed vulnerabilities of relying too heavily on China for pharmaceutical manufacturing and medical devices. Such sentiments could frustrate responses to this virus and future public health challenges by driving the two scientific communities apart when they should be working together to develop treatments and vaccines. For years before COVID-19, there was a raging debate about whether the US-Chinese competition would descend into a new Cold War. The odds of that happening now appear higher than ever. Another blow to the liberal international order. Last but not least, this entire situation is occurring against the backdrop of a liberal international order straining to the breaking point. As with other trends, this one was not created by COVID-19 but has been greatly exacerbated by it. As countries have understandably focused on contending with the virus within their own borders, multilateral institutions and organizations have struggled to galvanize a collective response, especially in the absence of American leadership. The Group of 7 and Group of 20 have convened but were forced to do so virtually due to the pandemic. Neither group has yet managed to move beyond rhetoric to actually take decisive steps to jointly combat the virus or mitigate its impact on the international economy. Meanwhile, at a time when the United Nations is contending with a dire liquidity crisis, it is struggling to finance its relatively paltry $2 billion COVID-19 response fund while the UN Security Council remains deadlocked by the blame game between the United States and China. As accusations of undue Chinese influence have also undermined the authority of the World Health Organization, the organization has become a political football in Washington. After his 2021 budget proposed slashing U.S. contributions to the World Health Organization, Trump is now threatening to suspend U.S. funding altogether, potentially depriving the organization leading the international effort to combat the virus of $400 million. The international institution at the greatest risk, however, could be the European Union. Over the past dozen years, the European Union has been battered by the 2008 financial crisis, the subsequent multi-year Eurozone debt crisis, the 2015 migration surge, Brexit, rising right-wing and populist movements, democratic backsliding in places like Hungary and Poland, rising transatlantic tensions with the Trump administration, and efforts by Russia to amplify Euroscepticism and sow division. Now, some analysts fear that the simultaneous health and economic disasters brought about by COVID-19 could push the European Union into the abyss. Countries are retreating to self-help tendencies, imposing border restrictions, and limiting the export of some vital medical equipment. And calls for economic assistance from Italy and Spain have reopened the wounds of the Eurozone crisis, with some northern European countries accusing southern European states of serially failing to responsibly handle their finances. This could be the straw that breaks the camel's back, Nathalie Toxai, director of the International Affairs Institute in Italy, told The Washington Post. The reason why coronavirus is such an epochal challenge is not that it brought things out of the blue. It touches on all spheres and does so by accentuating dynamics that are already there. It's as if it is bringing the extreme out of everything. Choices ahead. In his famous study The 20 Years Crisis, the historian E. H. Carr offered a withering critique of the utopian faith in liberal internationalism prominent in Britain and elsewhere during the interwar years. Carr outlined the realist view that history is a sequence of cause and effect, whose course can be analyzed and understood by intellectual effort, but not directed by imagination. Through this fatalistic lens, the COVID-19 pandemic would seem to represent an insurmountable challenge to international order. After all, it is not only a massive, multidimensional crisis requiring collective action on a global scale. It is also one that happens to magnify many pre-existing forces pushing geopolitics in a less cooperative and more conflictual direction. Yet, Carr was also careful to caution against pure realism because it fails to provide any ground for purposive or meaningful action, and because it offers nothing but a naked struggle for power which makes any kind of international society impossible. Even with compelling structural conditions pushing in one direction, the United States, the most powerful democracy on earth, still has agency. American leaders can choose to make a bad situation even worse, or they can choose to push against seemingly intractable realities and make things better. Unfortunately, at the moment, the Trump administration seems to be embracing the former choice. As one political scientist recently quipped on Twitter, we may be seeing the emergence of hegemonic stupidity theory. When the hegemon is stupid, the international system becomes unstable and prone to crisis. Snarky humor aside, if the United States leans into the forces of isolationism and nationalism, turns away from its allies and international cooperation, and fails to help other nations contend with this crisis because it is concerned with America first and only, the consequences will be even more calamitous. If it turns inward, this virus, which respects no borders, will be even harder to contain. The country will not just see untold suffering. It will also see the emergence of a post-coronavirus world in which America is poorer, less safe, and less able to determine its fate. That would be a disaster, and yet, if Trump continues to follow his instincts, that is precisely where things are headed. The country can choose a different path. After World War I, the United States turned its back on efforts to construct a better international order. However, after World War II, it championed the creation of international institutions, norms, and alliances that helped create a more stable, prosperous, and just world. It can do it again. Since the end of the Cold War, analysts have debated the priority that U.S. security calculations should give to transnational challenges. But, with the exception of America's forever wars against terrorism since 9/11, other diffuse transnational threats like climate change and pandemic disease have too often been treated as second or third-tier priorities. To say the least, the current crisis presents overwhelming evidence that that mentality should change. The 9/11 era may now be over, but other transnational threats are no longer hypothetical. They are here and demonstrably greater than any we have faced in our lifetimes. The virus and its accompanying economic and political fallout may cater to inward-looking, nationalist, self-help instincts. But the very nature of the crisis, like so many other transnational challenges, also contains a countervailing truth: only international cooperation can successfully slow the virus and mitigate the worst aftershocks flowing from it. It is that internationalist future that the United States should embrace. America can start by leading international efforts to confront COVID-19 itself. It can take a page from fellow democracies such as South Korea and Germany, and show the world it can marshal an effective response to the pandemic. It can take care of the urgent needs of the American people while also building a global coalition to combat the virus and the economic destruction it has wrought. It can speak the truth about COVID-19's origins while avoiding petty distractions that undermine common purpose. The United States can join with other nations to produce and identify life-saving equipment, therapeutics, and vaccines, and make sure they are distributed to the most vulnerable countries. It can collaborate with the world's best scientific and economic minds to anticipate the next stage of the crisis and the consequences that may follow, and use both existing and new institutional mechanisms to jointly develop coordinated responses. America can provide financial assistance, directly, alongside others, and through international financial institutions, to fragile economies. It can engage in humane diplomacy that loosens punishing sanctions and trade barriers that block medical assistance to countries being crushed by the virus. And, it can empower its development professionals and its military to provide vital humanitarian assistance where it is needed. Then, as the virus recedes, the United States can invest in the international infrastructure, rules, and coordinating bodies needed to head off the next great catastrophe. Instead of berating its closest friends, it can strengthen its democratic alliances as the focal point for addressing shared challenges. It can seize the opportunity to rethink the fundamentals of globalization to shift it in a more egalitarian and resilient direction. And, it can do all of this in a way that shows the world that America's enlightened self-interest and values can still be a lodestar for a stable international order. The COVID-19 pandemic is a once-in-a-century global challenge. It necessitates a truly global response. With US leadership that rises to the occasion, the current moment could be an opportunity to show that international cooperation on a grand scale is still possible and desirable. That is a future worth fighting for, and it remains within America's ability to shape it. Colin H. Cowell is co-director of Stanford University's Center for International Security, a strategic consultant at the Penn